The year is 1802. In the blazing fields of Saint-Domingue, a black man rides a white horse through smoke and ruin. His eyes burn brighter than the fires consuming the land. He raises his sword and shouts, "We were born in chains, but our children will be born free." Europe called him a slave. History remembers him as the man who broke empires. His name was Toussaint Louverture, the slave who defeated the armies of the world. In 1743, on the island of Saint-Domingue, today known as Haiti, a child was born beneath the brutal sun of the Caribbean. The land was the jewel of the French Empire, the richest colony on earth, and the most merciless. Every year, ships arrived from Africa, loaded with human cargo men, women, and children torn from their homes, branded, and sold to die on the sugar plantations. The air itself smelled of molasses and blood. That child's name was Toussaint. He was small, thin, and quiet, with eyes that watched everything. His father had once been a tribal chief from the Fon people of Benin, a man of dignity and wisdom, captured by slave traders and stripped of his throne, his land, and his gods. His mother, a woman of faith, whispered to him in the dark about ancestors who once ruled kingdoms, about freedom that lived in memory even when chains bound the flesh. Toussaint grew up on the Breda plantation, owned by a wealthy Frenchman. He worked in the stables, caring for horses. Unlike most slaves, he was allowed to learn to read and write, a rare and dangerous privilege. The overseer, impressed by his intelligence, lent him books, the Bible, Epictetus, and the works of enlightenment, philosophers, Rousseau, Voltaire, and Abbé Raynal. Toussaint read them in secret, his candle burning low, his heart pounding with forbidden knowledge. From the Bible he learned compassion, from the philosophers he learned rebellion, and from the horses he tended he learned endurance. He saw the cruelty of the world clearly. Slaves whipped until their backs bled, women taken by force, old men dying in the fields under the lash. But he also saw that cruelty was not invincible. God did not create men to be slaves, he once told a friend. If he had, he would not have given them the desire to be free. Toussaint married a woman named Suzanne and had 2 sons. He became a coachman, respected for his discipline and calm. To the plantation owners, he seemed loyal, even gentle. But beneath his calm exterior, something immense was forming, a quiet storm waiting for the right wind. The right wind would come in 1791, when the world itself began to tremble. In 1789, across the ocean, the French Revolution erupted, shouting to the world about liberty, equality, fraternity. The words echoed through palaces and prisons alike, but in Saint-Domingue, they sounded like a cruel joke. Liberty, equality. The colony had 500,000 enslaved people, and only 30,000 whites who ruled them with iron and fire. But words, once released, cannot be caged. By 1791, whispers of rebellion spread through the plantations. Drums spoke in the forests at night. Leaders met in secret, invoking African gods and Christian saints alike. The slaves prayed not for forgiveness but for vengeance. In August of that year, the storm broke. More than 100,000 enslaved men and women rose in arms, burning the plantations that had devoured their lives. Cane fields turned into seas of fire. The mountains glowed red through the night. White planters fled or were cut down. The world's richest colony had become a battlefield. Toussaint, now 48 years old, watched the flames from afar. At first, he hesitated. He was no butcher. He did not want chaos. He wanted justice. But when he saw French soldiers shoot into crowds of unarmed black men, when he saw women hung from trees as examples, something inside him shifted forever. He joined the rebels. Unlike many of his comrades, Toussaint understood strategy. He had read about Caesar and Alexander, about how to command loyalty through discipline. While others sought revenge, he sought victory. He trained his followers to fight with order, forbidding the killing of civilians, protecting women and children, and punishing looters. He said, "Liberty cannot be built on blood alone. It must be built on respect." Under his guidance, a mob became an army. They learned to strike and vanish into the forests, to use the terrain as a weapon. Toussaint's leadership spread like wildfire soon. He commanded thousands. Europe took notice. To the French planters, he was a devil. To the slaves, he was a prophet. To history, he was becoming a legend. As the colony burned and the empire trembled, a single question rose from the ashes. Could a man born in chains become the architect of freedom? By 1794, the uprising had become more than a rebellion. It was a revolution. Toussaint Louverture, once a slave in the fields, now stood as one of the most respected commanders on the island. His rise was not built on bloodlust but on clarity of purpose. He did not fight for revenge. He fought for a vision, a land where no child would ever be born in chains again. At first, Toussaint allied with the Spanish, who controlled the eastern side of the island, today's Dominican Republic. Spain saw in him a useful weapon against their French enemies. They gave him guns, ammunition, and uniforms. His army grew stronger, more disciplined, more organized. But Toussaint's loyalty was not to Spain, nor to France. It was to freedom. Then, across the ocean, something remarkable happened. In 1794, the French revolutionary government, desperate and divided, abolished slavery throughout all its colonies. The dream that had once seemed impossible was now written in law. When Toussaint heard the news, he made a decision that stunned everyone. He changed sides. He left the Spanish and joined the French Republic, declaring, "I have returned to my motherland, which has acknowledged the equality of all men." It was an act both moral and strategic, for the Spanish still defended slavery, while revolutionary France, at least for the moment, had renounced it. Under the tricolor flag, Toussaint's forces grew into an army that terrified Europe. They defeated the British, who had tried to invade. They pushed the Spanish from the island. By 1798, he ruled almost all of Saint-Domingue. But he ruled differently. He rebuilt plantations not with whips, but with wages, proving that a free man could work for prosperity as fiercely as any slave under a lash. He reopened ports, restored trade, and brought order to a land scarred by war. Even his enemies respected him. A British general once said, "There is no man in the world who combines such mildness with such firmness." Toussaint called himself Louverture, the opening, because he believed he was opening the path to freedom for his people. But as his star rose, so did suspicion in Paris. To many white leaders, the idea of a black man ruling the richest colony on earth was unthinkable. Freedom, it seemed, had limits, at least to those who feared equality. In 1801, Toussaint Louverture took a step that changed history forever. He wrote and signed a new constitution for Saint-Domingue, one that declared, "There shall be no slaves on this territory. All men are born, live, and die free," in French. But this constitution also declared something more daring. Toussaint would be governor for life. To his followers, it was justice. The man who had freed them would now protect their freedom. To France, it was rebellion. From his residence in Cap Français, Toussaint ruled not as a tyrant but as a reformer. He rebuilt schools, hospitals, and roads. He encouraged interracial harmony and forbade discrimination. He even invited white planters to return, promising them safety if they treated workers fairly. He dreamed of a Haiti that could stand as a mirror to the world, a nation where black and white, rich and poor, could work together under the banner of liberty. But across the Atlantic, that dream was poison to one man's pride: Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, then first consul of France, looked at Saint-Domingue not as a nation but as property. The thought of a black governor ruling the empire's richest island enraged him. "I will restore order there," he said. "There will be no black France." In January 1802, he sent his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, with 20,000 soldiers, veterans of Europe's wars, to crush Toussaint's government. Their secret orders were clear: capture Toussaint, reinstate slavery, and erase his name from history. When the French fleet appeared on the horizon, the people of Saint-Domingue knew what awaited them. Toussaint gathered his commanders and said quietly, "The French have brought with them the whip, but they will find the island has turned to fire." He ordered the sugarcane fields burned so the invaders would have no food, no cover, no profit. He told his soldiers to strike from the forests and the mountains, to fight not as an army of men but as a force of nature. And then, before sending them into battle, he whispered to his generals, "Better to perish in the flames of liberty than to live under the shadow of chains." As cannons thundered and the sky filled with smoke, Toussaint Louverture, the once enslaved coachman, now stood as the commander of a nation, facing down the greatest empire in Europe. What Napoleon saw as rebellion, history would remember as the birth of freedom. The invasion began with thunder. French ships lined the coasts of Saint-Domingue, their black cannons aimed at the mountains. Drums rolled through the forest as the defenders prepared. Toussaint Louverture, once a slave who knew the crack of the whip, now faced the full might of Napoleon's army. But he had one advantage the French could never understand. He knew the land, and he knew the hearts of his people. He turned the island itself into a weapon. The plan was simple and ruthless. Burn everything that could feed the enemy. Destroy bridges, poison wells, cut roads through the forest so narrow that cannons could not pass. The French advanced and found only ashes, silence, and ambushes. In the mist-covered hills, Haitian soldiers struck with machetes and muskets, then vanished like ghosts. The humid air carried fever and death. European soldiers fell by the thousands, not from bullets, but from disease and despair. One French officer wrote, "We are not fighting men, we are fighting the spirit of liberty itself." Toussaint led from the front. He rode through storms and gunfire, his white horse like a phantom against the burning horizon. He refused comfort, slept on the ground, ate what his soldiers ate. When men faltered, he reminded them, "Freedom is not given, it is taken." Yet war is never clean. Villages burned, families starved. Toussaint's heart broke as he watched his land, the paradise of his youth, turn into a charred wasteland. But he would not surrender. Then the French used their oldest weapon, deception. They began spreading rumors that Napoleon had sent them not to restore slavery, but to secure peace, that France still loved her children in the colonies. Leclerc, Napoleon's brother-in-law, sent Toussaint letters filled with flattery, calling him a great man who deserves France's gratitude. The island trembled between hope and suspicion. Could it be true? Could the same empire that had once chained them now wish for peace? Toussaint's advisors warned him, "It is a trap." But the general, weary from years of war, saw a chance to spare his people. He agreed to meet Leclerc not as a conqueror or a slave, but as a man who still believed in honor. That meeting would seal his fate. The day of the meeting was clear and silent. Toussaint wore his uniform, polished and white, the one he had worn during the signing of the Constitution. He rode slowly through the camp toward Leclerc's tent, his officers uneasy but obedient. "Trust," he said, "is the last gift I can give to peace." Leclerc greeted him with smiles and compliments. They dined together, drank wine, spoke of rebuilding the island. For a moment, it seemed as if the nightmare might end, but beneath the table, orders had already been written. At the end of the meal, French soldiers entered the tent. "General Louverture," Leclerc said, his tone suddenly cold, "by order of the First Consul of France, you are under arrest." Toussaint did not resist. He looked around the room at the faces of men who once called him ally and said quietly, "You think you are taking me, but you are taking yourselves." He was shackled, placed under heavy guard, and forced aboard a ship bound for France. As the island faded from sight, his wife and sons beside him wept. Toussaint stood on deck and whispered, "They have cut down the tree of liberty, but its roots are deep, and they will grow again." When he arrived in France, he was taken not to Paris, but to the frozen mountains of the Jura, to Fort de Joux, a fortress built to hold political prisoners and to erase them. There, the general who had commanded tens of thousands was locked in a small stone cell, with no light, no fire, and no voice to hear him. Napoleon had ordered that he be kept in complete isolation. His guards were forbidden to speak to him. His letters were confiscated. He was not a man now, he was a silence the empire wanted to bury. Through the icy nights, he scratched words into scraps of paper smuggled to his jailers. In one he wrote, "I have served my country and my people faithfully. If I am guilty, it is only of their freedom." Winter deepened. The snow piled against the walls. His body weakened, but his spirit did not. To the end, he prayed not for rescue, but for justice. On the 7th of April 1803, Toussaint Louverture, the man who had defeated Europe's armies, freed his people, and dreamed of equality, died alone in his cell, of starvation and pneumonia. He was 59 years old. But outside his prison walls, something extraordinary was already happening. The tree he spoke of, the tree of liberty, was beginning to grow again in the blood-soaked soil of Saint-Domingue. The snow never stopped falling over Fort de Joux. The fortress clung to the cliffs of the Jura Mountains like a scar upon the earth, its stone walls thick with frost. Inside one of its lowest chambers, behind an iron door, lay a man once called the opening Louverture. Toussaint Louverture had been many things: a slave, a horseman, a general, a governor. Now he was nothing more than a prisoner wrapped in rags. His cell was small, barely enough for him to stretch his legs. The only window was a slit in the wall, letting in the wind but not the sun. His bed was a pile of straw. His breath froze on the stone each night. Yet even here, in the silence of death, his mind remained alive. He remembered the sound of drums from the mountains of Saint-Domingue, the scent of sugarcane burning, the laughter of his sons. He prayed for them, for his people, and even for his enemies. "Forgive them," he whispered, "for they know not the fire they have lit." The guards, forbidden to speak to him, avoided his gaze. They said that when he looked at them, they felt shame. Perhaps they were right, for outside that cell, Europe had already begun to doubt the justice of his imprisonment. In the reports sent to Paris, the governor of the fortress wrote, "He is calm. He reads his Bible. He says he has no regrets." Toussaint knew he would not leave the mountains alive. He wrote to the Minister of Marine. The letter never reached him. "I was once a faithful servant of France. I saved this colony for her. I defended her flag. And yet I die here, forgotten, while she returns to chains the men who fought for her liberty." Each day, his body weakened. The cold gnawed at his bones. The hunger hollowed his chest. But he kept his dignity. When the guards entered, they found him standing, coat buttoned, hat on his head, a general still. On the night before his death, he prayed one last time, not for his life, but for his people. "Let freedom live," he said softly, "even if it must walk over my grave." At dawn, the 7th of April 1803, the fortress was quiet. The frost clung to the bars of his window like glass. Inside, Toussaint Louverture lay still, the man who had freed a nation, frozen in silence by the empire he had once served. But his death, meant to extinguish hope, became the spark that lit the final war for Haiti's independence. When word of Toussaint's arrest reached Saint-Domingue, the people did not cry, they prepared. They had known betrayal before. They had known hunger and fire and the taste of blood. But now they knew something else, that liberty was worth dying for. In the north, Toussaint's lieutenant, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, rose in fury. Once a slave like his master, he had been forged in the same flames. "The French have taken our father," he told his soldiers, "but we will take their empire." Napoleon's forces, already ravaged by yellow fever, found themselves surrounded by enemies they could not see. The mountains became traps, the forests, graveyards. The same land that had nurtured Toussaint's revolt now finished what he had begun. Dessalines' army marched with a single cry: liberty or death. They burned the tricolor flag of France and replaced it with one of their own, blue and red, torn from the French flag to erase the white stripe that once symbolized the masters. By 1803, the French army had lost more than 50,000 men, not to battle, but to disease, heat, and despair. Even General Leclerc, Napoleon's brother-in-law, was dead. The survivors begged to leave. On the 18th of November 1803, the final battle was fought at Vertières. Haitian soldiers, barefoot and hungry, charged against the cannons of Europe. When a bullet struck the flag-bearer, another man picked up the flag and shouted, "Forward for Toussaint." By the end of the day, the French were defeated. Dessalines stood on the smoking field and said, "We have avenged our leader." The following year, on the 1st of January 1804, Haiti declared its independence, the first free black republic in the world. A nation born not of conquest, but of resistance. Its declaration read, "We have dared to be free. Let us be so by ourselves and for ourselves." Napoleon, upon hearing the news, slammed his fist on the table. "I have lost the jewel of my crown," he muttered. But what he had truly lost was control over the idea that had escaped Saint-Domingue, the idea that all men, even those once enslaved, could rise to govern themselves. Toussaint had not lived to see it, but his prophecy had come true. You can kill the body, but not the spirit of liberty. In the cane fields, where he was once chained, children now played freely. On the mountains, where he once hid from patrols, the Haitian flag waved against the sky. The man the world had called a slave had become something far greater, a symbol of what humanity could be when it refused to kneel. And though the French erased his name from their records, the winds that passed over the island still carried it softly. Toussaint Louverture, the opening. Toussaint Louverture died in the silence of a prison cell, but his voice never stopped echoing. In the years that followed, his name became a whisper carried by trade winds across the Atlantic, from Havana to New Orleans, from Dakar to Paris. Wherever men and women still bent under chains, they spoke of him. In Haiti, the freedmen who once called him Papa Toussaint began to teach their children his words. "I was born a slave," he had said, "but I will die a free man." Those words became scripture. They were repeated in church sermons, carved into walls, sung in songs. Toussaint's dream was no longer a rebellion, it was an identity. His victory terrified the old world. In the courts of Europe, Haiti's freedom was spoken of in whispers. Monarchs called it an infection, the dangerous belief that the oppressed could rise. Slave-owning nations such as Britain, Spain, and the United States refused to recognize Haiti for decades, fearing the idea would spread. And it did. Across the Americas, enslaved people heard the story of a black general who had defeated Napoleon's army, the most powerful military in the world. In the plantations of Cuba, in the sugar fields of Brazil, in the cotton lands of the American South, they whispered his name as both prayer and prophecy. Toussaint Louverture became more than a man. He became a myth. Artists painted him astride a white horse, surrounded by fire and rain. Poets called him the Black Spartacus. Abolitionists from London to Philadelphia invoked his courage as proof that liberty belonged to all. Even his enemies could not erase him. In Paris, a French senator once remarked bitterly, "We imprisoned Toussaint in the mountains, but his spirit has conquered the plains." What he left behind was not wealth or empire, but a question. If a man born in slavery could rise to lead a nation and challenge the world's greatest armies, what, then, was truly impossible? His revolution did not end in 1804. It lived on in every struggle for dignity that came after. In the 19th century, it inspired revolts in Jamaica, Venezuela, and Colombia. In the 20th, it guided Martin Luther King Jr., Kwame Nkrumah, and Nelson Mandela, men who saw in Toussaint not only a hero, but a mirror. And in Haiti, though poverty and hardship would return, there remained something no empire could destroy: the knowledge that once, the poorest of the poor had beaten the masters of the world. Toussaint's portrait still hangs in Haitian schools, his eyes solemn, his uniform immaculate. And when children are asked what freedom means, they do not quote philosophers, they quote him. "In overthrowing me," he said, "you have cut down only the trunk of the tree of liberty. It will spring up again by the roots, for they are many and deep." And so it did. Toussaint Louverture's life began in bondage and ended in ice. But between those two extremes, he achieved something few humans ever have. He transformed suffering into salvation and turned oppression into a weapon of liberation. He was not perfect. He could be strict, even severe. He demanded obedience from his soldiers, order from his people, and faith from his followers. But his discipline was not born of cruelty. It was born of clarity. He knew that chaos was the excuse tyranny always used to return. He was not merely fighting for himself, or even for Haiti. He was fighting to prove a universal truth, that freedom, once awakened, could belong to anyone, anywhere, regardless of color or birth. That truth terrified emperors and inspired generations. It still does. The world often remembers conquerors, kings, and killers. Their statues rise in marble, their names carved in gold. But Toussaint's monument is not made of stone. It lives in the soil of Haiti, in every cane stalk that sways in the Caribbean wind, and in every nation that ever broke its own chains. Even Napoleon, who once called him a black Jacobin too proud for his station, could not erase his defeat. The empire that sought to bury him collapsed within a decade. Toussaint's republic endures. History teaches us that liberty is fragile. It can be betrayed, sold, or forgotten. But as long as one person remembers Toussaint's words, it cannot be truly lost. Liberty is the daughter of courage, and she has no master. Today, when the sun sets over Haiti and the evening wind passes through the sugar fields, the air seems to hum softly like a hymn. People say it is the voice of Toussaint, carried by the wind, reminding his descendants that freedom has no chains except those we allow. He began life as property. He died as a prisoner, but he lives forever as a symbol. A man who opened the door Louverture not only for Haiti, but for humanity itself. And if you listen closely, across oceans and centuries, you can still hear him whisper, "You can chain my body, but never my soul. For I am the breath of freedom, and I will rise again."